Welcome, Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the identification the patient has towards the therapist. It's a vast and complex issue, and I'm not going to be treating of every specific instance of it because it's a very large phenomena. However, I'm going to be talking about three basic types of identification from the patient to the therapist. The first, and perhaps the first one chronologically that happens in therapy, is the identification to what is supposed to be the desire of the therapist, i.e., what the patient thinks the therapist wants from them. The second is pseudo identification, and the third one that I'll be talking about is deep identification. Okay, so let's start with the first one. For example, when people start coming to therapy, there's this process called transference, which I've already talked about, and I'm not going to redo an explanation. But basically, therapy involves unconscious images of one's parents, one's love relationships that are replayed in the space with the therapist, i.e., the patient is going to come in and start having certain feelings, both positive and negative. And when I mean feelings, I don't mean just sexual feelings, right? I do mean friendly feelings, feelings of complicity, feelings of hopefulness, and so on and so forth, right? And again, in the negative, it can be very mild. It can just be a certain form of skepticism, and it can go up until the effect of distrusting or disliking the therapist. The idea is that transference is a form of attachment, right? That the patient has towards the therapist, in which it's not really the therapist as who they are that's at play, but rather basically what the patient has in his mind for the therapeutic relationship. I.e., for example, if there's been unconscious images of parents that have been very severe, the patient might fear the same type of severity from the therapist, or on the opposite end, might not be afraid, but might hope that the therapist will allow everything and will be almost a friend with them. So that's transference. And so at the beginning of therapy, it's very common for patients to basically identify with what they think is the desire of the therapist. So in this phase, for example, patients will often say, I want to come every week or twice a week. I'm going to talk about my dreams, because if the therapist is a psychoanalyst, they're going to say, oh, well, that's what psychoanalysts love. They love dreams. I'm going to talk about my dreams. They might also be very prone to agree with the therapist at everything they say, regardless of if it's really true or not, because what they want is to make the therapist happy, and because in their unconscious minds, if the therapist is happy, then they will be happy. If the therapist is happy, then they're a good patient, and therefore they're going to be able to stay with the therapist for longer, or the therapist is going to basically praise them or be happy with them. Therefore, their self-image is going to improve, or that's the hope that they have, at least in the start of therapy. So in this phase, they might very well be on time, never miss a session, never cancel, be in a way perfect patients. However, and this is important, it's a trick, because fundamentally, when they're in that mode of being the perfect patient, they're not really going into themselves. It's more like they're trying to secure the relationship. And often when they have, for example, aggressive wishes towards a therapist, or that they feel resentful, they might hide it or be afraid of sharing it, because they're afraid that it will break down the relationship, because it wouldn't fit into that what the therapist desires of me as a patient. Therefore, it is very important to not cut it down directly, but to slowly unbuild it or frame it differently. For example, I have the feeling that there's something perhaps that you're angry about, but you're not telling me, right? If you feel that there might be some anger issues, or if you feel that they're basically trying to please you, you might be able to say things like, I have the feeling that you're basically putting me first, whereas this should be about you. Often patients in that phase will often try and ask questions to have glimpses of the life of the therapist. Like, for example, they might ask them where they went on vacation, or they might try and build a rapport in which it's more, how can I say, less framed and professional, but more wobbly. And when I mean that, I don't mean in this borderline state of I want to know everything about you, right? Or in this pseudo merging with the object. That I don't mean that, but I mean just this kind of more perhaps human and warmth kind of interaction. So in this phase, basically, they're going to play a certain role. That role is at first essential because it's how they've been taught to or to acquire a relationship or to stabilize it. Therefore, if the therapist tries to change the patterns from the get-go, it won't work, and often the patients might even be afraid because they will feel how can my good patient persona be one that fails or one that's not perfect? What do they expect of me, and so on and so forth. Problem is with that is that the patient will start to try and become what the therapist wants. So it's important to accept it at the very start, but to slowly unbuild it and to let who the true patient is to emerge, regardless of what's going to cause on the therapeutic relationship. And the same way, and it's important to explain that to the patient, that regardless of what the patient says or thinks about the therapist or how he perceives them, the professional relationship will remain, that it's not fragile enough to be destroyed if the patient doesn't fit in the mold of the perfect patient, or if he doesn't fit what the therapist desires of him. That's also very important to state that nothing gets destroyed. And from there, the patient can slowly but surely let that adaptation go for something more genuine. This doesn't mean that the patient is completely disingenuous, right? Of course not. But it means that they can let that adaptation go, which is very energy consuming, in order for them to focus on their issues, right? Right. So then we're going to move on to what I call pseudo identification. So it isn't necessarily rare that, for example, if the therapist has narcissistic patients or patients who have identity vulnerabilities, be it because of psychosis or mood disorders or something of the like that fragile makes it fragile, the sense of identity, that they might identify with the therapist to basically withhold the sense of identity. Like, for example, let's start with, for example, narcissistic patients. It isn't uncommon for narcissistic patients to basically read about psychology, psychoanalysis, psychiatry, and come to a therapist with that knowledge. In a way, what they're trying to do is to, very interestingly enough, to present as if they were the same, on the same level, but this is not identification, contrary to what one may think from on the surface level. This is the opposite. This is resisting identification by trying to be absolutely full, to be completely like having no needs. The other one cannot fulfill a need if you already know. And very interestingly enough, this aims to basically create a gap between the therapist and the patient, a gap that is there to protect the patient because the patient feels that if they were in need, then they would be basically too vulnerable. Therefore, they have to know. And this is there to prevent the therapist from giving certain types of interpretation or even guessing what the therapist is going to say in order to be able to be one step ahead of the therapist and basically give the interpretations themselves or be able to foresee what the therapist is going to say in order to prevent the unknown, which is scary because if it's unknown, then they can't prepare for it, then they're not ready for it. And basically they're trying to protect their sense of identity through this form of pseudo-identification, i.e. trying to be like the therapist on the same ground, if not, and if they have severe narcissistic issues, they might even feel that they're above the therapist, have more knowledge, and are more capable of driving the therapy than the therapist themselves. So very important to not understand this as identification, but on the opposite, it's a counter-identification, a resistance to the transference process that I mentioned earlier, but also in a way to master the relationship, i.e., if I know everything you know, I don't need you, right? So the second volley of this pseudo-identification that I was talking about is the psychotic element. For example, psychotic patients might themselves feel that they are both reinforced and also made more fragile by therapy, because they might feel very, very dependent, very vulnerable on the therapist. This might also apply in certain cases for borderline patients, not always, of course, not always with psychotics either. But the idea is that basically they will try and when they understand something of the therapist, they'll try and stick to it in a very rigid manner. Like, for example, if they know, let's say, that the therapist does things in a certain way, they might imitate the therapist to try and basically be like them, with this idea that if I'm like him, therefore I don't have to be myself. I don't have to suffer like myself because I'm like someone that I identify with. I am basically incorporating, i.e., putting the therapist inside of me in order to not be me. And this is a very severe defense mechanism which helps the patient on a day-to-day basis, but also prevents them from accessing who they really are, because basically they're overly identifying to the therapist, and it's pseudo identification in the sense that it doesn't leave this form of incorporation doesn't leave any room for them, for who they are. This creates a gap in which the therapist tries to reach for them, but when they reach, then the patient withdraws or presents them with like a mirror of themselves, or it's not even what the therapist wants them to be, it's what they think the therapist is. So therefore, there might be a form of trying to merge with the therapist. And in the more severe cases, for example, people who have very fragile identities, they might even mimic the movements of the therapist or the phrasing or the wording of the therapist in order to be like him, to become him, in order to protect against themselves and their bad elements that they cannot yet process. Of course, when I'm saying this, I need to nuance. It's not to say that they can't do it with a lot of therapeutic work. And I also think that in these cases, the whole aim of therapy is to be able to create a detachment, a space between therapist and patient, i.e. a transitional space between both parties. A third space, if we were to use Ogden's vocabulary, right? So this is what the framework I've called pseudo identification. And the third that I'm going to talk about, and perhaps the one that's the most notable at the end of therapy, is this form of deep identification. So at the end of therapy, when, for example, transference is starting to be liquidated, i.e., the process has ended, the patient has basically recovered from their symptomatology, and they're not necessarily in demand, or they don't feel as need for the therapy as they used to, they feel much better. There might be, very interestingly enough, a form of deep identification with the therapist, as the patient might start to develop a very keen interest in or psychology or psychoanalysis. This keen interest is very interesting in many regards, because it shows that there is something that the patient keeps from the therapist, and there's also a part of them that wants to be a bit like the therapist. But contrary to pseudo identification, this doesn't prevent their identity. Quite the opposite. It's like they start to understand psychology, but they want to understand psychology within their own realm or within their own interests. For example, it's not rare that patients might read books in psychology that they find interesting, but are not necessarily what the therapist would find interesting or what the therapist reads. This is quite a good demonstration of how strong their identity is, that they can both have an identification with a therapist but not be limited by it. They can explore in their own realms. And to the major extent, some patients might even retrain as or psychotherapists or psychologists or even psychiatrists. For example, in the case of Gérard Haddad, he is a psychiatrist, but he also used to be the patient of Jacques Lacan. I'm saying this because he openly talks about it and he wrote a book about it, so it's not secret or anything of the ilk. So basically, he was an engineer, and through his relationship with Lacan, his therapeutic relationship with Lacan, he was inspired himself to become a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, because he identified with Lacan and with the good relationship and the good fatherly figure that the con represented for him. So therefore, in these cases, basically the patient, very importantly enough, identifies with all the good elements that the therapist has given them and feels that that identification is so strong that they can then basically work with other patients, help other people, in a way transmit the gratitude that they had with the relationship with the therapist with other people. Uh, Basically, they repeating a cycle of good elements. For example, and I understand this as because the framework of therapy is a very intense process of both parties. As I was saying at the beginning of the video, it re-triggers infantile wishes, hopes, and what the relationship with the parents or the siblings should have been. Therefore, and very importantly, when it happens well, when the process goes well, the therapist is basically assimilated to a good parent, and that good parent that helped rebuild oneself. And therefore, part of the building blocks that helped to rebuild are taken in, and sometimes they are considered with a lot of admiration and happiness. And therefore, these patients think, and often they're right, that they can then become themselves therapists and help other people. In a way, they can give what was given to them and basically extend the cycle of help to someone else, all while being happy with themselves and the happy therapist that they've internalized, i.e., the happy parent that they've internalized. Also, and this is very important, that doesn't mean that the therapist should necessarily train the patient when it happens, right? It's basically it's the patient's journey to go through that if that's the desire. But nevertheless, it's quite interesting. And I've always felt that this was a true success in psychotherapy when the patient can identify in a deep way to the therapist and to the function of the therapist without becoming the therapist or without trying to become. I.e., what they can do is they can do it themselves, but in their own way. And this I always felt was a very good testament to how successful the therapy is, because basically it shows that something that wasn't there, wasn't present, has been able to be born in them, to be able to give them the hope that A, they can be mentally healthy, but B, they can also help others becoming mentally healthy. A bit like the child identifies with the parent. For example, if the parent does something positive, the child often wants to do the same or wants to be the same as the good parent. It's notably visible when, for example, children or adult children take on the mantle of the, let's say, the parent's business or take on the same craft as the parent. This shows that something good has been basically transmitted from generation to generation. And I'm not saying it's always good things, right? There can be a whole plethora of reasons why someone would do the same thing, i.e., easiness, economic situations. I mean, this can be so much, but this idea that something good has been transmitted is very fundamental, and it's a testament to how well the therapy has worked. And it doesn't mean that every patient has to become or try and become or have an interest in psychotherapy, quite the opposite. But those who do had that inside of them, but weren't able to connect with it, and with the therapy, they've connected with it and now are able to go on and help other people, which is fundamentally positive. Also, I should say this because I find it very interesting. When I started my training as a psychologist, teachers often told us that a patient that becomes a therapist is a testament, not to success as I was just saying, but as failure, because the patient isn't seeing their own desires. And for a long time I thought that that was the case, but looking back on it now and having my own practice and working with people, I can attest that it's not the case. It's only the case if the patient basically does it to please the therapist. But some people deeply have the desire to do something that they feel meaningful and they find meaning into this process. So I disagree with my professors at the time. I think it's a good sin on the whole given that it's their true desire, right? And it's not something that's superimposed onto them by the therapist of like, oh, you should be a therapist. If it comes from them, that's great. And I think that that's so wonderful, as it shows that something good has been transmitted from professional to patient. Anyway, that was the talk on the three types of anti-identification. I'm not saying there aren't others, there might be a whole plethora of them, but those were the ones I was focused on today. So I hope you liked this video. If you have any questions, anything you'd like to ask, feel free to drop them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.